Okay, so this is going to be a recap of a conversation I had. Overheard my parents fighting in the other room, and I went in to try to just maybe insert myself so they could team up against me and, just finish the fight. My mom was going off on the same liberal stuff in terms of, Comey getting fired, it's scary, and the Russians are controlling us. And so my dad was just trying to calm her down, and she got pulled into, of course, how can you even remember how a conversation like that gets pulled into race? Her stance is that, everything's race, everything comes back to slavery. And I was saying, well, how come people blacks from the West Indies and blacks from Nigeria, immigrants, do better than, native-born blacks? And she just could not understand that. Like, she was just like, white privilege exists. And I was like, well, yeah, even though white privilege exists, certain groups of black people do very well or are keeping up with, working class standards in whatever areas that they immigrate to. And other groups of blacks, are lagging and, creating more of a criminal class. Just from a sociological standpoint, I mean, this has nothing to do with how you feel or, these are just statistics. And so I told my mom that Nigerians, as an ethnicity in America, actually make more than whites on average. And she did, which happens a lot when I talk to somebody like her, or when people talk to their parents, you are not believed. This statistic is just not believed. And she goes, "Oh, what do I know about that? I don't spend my life on the internet." So, claiming to be a complete expert on all the reasons why the black community is suffering, and then when you say, well, did you know that Nigerian immigrants actually are doing better than white people? Did you know that the illegitimacy rate is 75%? She would accept that, but that she wouldn't accept that was increased from the past. In her version, it has just always been awful, and it was just always that bad. So you're talking to somebody who cannot deal with the facts. My dad was getting berated by my mom. He was saying some negative things about blacks, like, they're animals and like animals need to be taken off the streets and stuff. And of course, my mom was like, "Oh, that's so disgraceful for you to say." So he was definitely saying some, racially charged stuff. But just because you're using racially charged language doesn't necessarily mean that, you hold racist beliefs. For instance, let's say there's a Japanese guy who immigrates to the United States, gets into a fight with a black guy, or a shouting match, or something like that. He might call him use the N-word or something like that, not because he has that belief against all black people or, holds a resentment against all people, but might use the perceived, sociological status marker in a situation of a fight. So he's not racist because he uses the N-word. He's racist actually because he's Japanese, and all Japanese people are racist. So it's a different form of racism, right? When it's a cultural family heritage, like the way Japanese people would be racist, or the way like all white women would be racist in terms of like not wanting to date a black guy. That's kind of like a racist thing, if you think about it. Now, I think that's a natural, benign, and positive, or unavoidable aspect of it. So, of course, whenever you're talking about racism, it gets back to, what do you mean by racism? Do you mean bad racism, or the natural kind of in-group preference and things like that, or just noticing patterns, realizing that some groups have different effects on society, and I was listing, instances of racism. And one of my claims was that, so I was listing reasons why the black community fundamentally is suffering. And in my analysis, it happens to be that welfare and subsidized housing, rent control, rent stabilization, seem like, on the surface, obviously, completely humane and like humanitarian and like pro-social, charitable type thing to do. Of course, you can see those arguments. You can obviously see the arguments against them as well, right? It's just like a waste of money, encouraging people to waste money. So, the idea is like, what are the effects that, why are black people having an illegitimacy rate of 75% nationwide across the board? And then like think about in the urban centers or the inner cities, post-industrial cities, what those numbers look like. And of course, what effect that has on society. And so can we say that the illegitimacy rate of 75% across the board being, of course, much higher than, what would be the white average, or, the Asian average, or is even lower, or the, is that all due to racism? Now, I'm a reasonable person. I know that there's a lot of input, so I'm going to say, and I'm not one of those conservatives, or, one of those person who sometimes has sympathy with conservative viewpoints, who's going to say, oh, racism doesn't exist. So I think there's a reasonable thing to say that in terms of the achievement gap, or in terms of why blacks basically are a bastard generation. I mean, that's not even using judgmental language, right? I mean, because someone who's adopted is a bastard. So why are they? Could you say it's because of racism? That's one of the inputs, but I don't think that's the main input. And so for somebody like my mom, she's just going to completely, I guess, hunker down and just say that, yep, racism is 100% of the problem of blacks. And then, then you have to explain that, why people in England might be racist against black people when there was no, legacy of chattel slavery taking place on the continent of England, even though all the people who owned the slaves and all the ships were harbored there. So, I was giving an example about the fundamental reason why the black community doesn't practice essentially like monogamy or nuclear family now, is because the black women have all these subsidized housing, food stamps, and they have affirmative action helping them get a job more than it helps the men get a job. The men get a job. And so I was just saying, in a broader sense, there are all these disincentives for black women to, marry a guy, because they have that rent control, rent stabilization, welfare checks, unemployment checks, disability checks, prescriptions coming in that they sell on the black market, or, any number of ways that people are surviving based on entitlements. And I was just saying plainly that this obviously provides a complete disincentive for, women of child rearing age to have any desire to marry someone. And of course there are also reasons that, structurally, manual jobs have disappeared. Unions have disappeared from the biggest cities in the Northeast. So there are structural reasons why women have migrated well into the service sector, and black men haven't found new sectors in the Northeast. So to be a black woman, there's a more vibrant economy than a black man, because they're more there's less racism against them. And this is the point of contention where my dad decided to fight me. Even though I was just making a broader argument about all of the different disincentives that black women have in terms of the free money they get from society or the government, And the fact that, in their community, they can just, like, have their own mom, like, watch their kids and stuff, and it's not seen as a bad thing anymore. So it's like a multi-generational matriarchal thing. So they have those things to kind of, like, rely on, where they're like, a white woman wouldn't be able to rely on their grandparents as much. To be, like, kind of like a nanny or a primary caregiver. Because that happens a lot in the minority communities. When, like, moms get strung out and then grandma becomes the mom. Because it's kids having kids and whatever. So, unfortunately, just not understanding the etiquette of a debate, I was making a broader point about all the different disincentives that, black women have to get married. And one of them was that black women are more welcome in a typical, office environment than black men. Because maybe they would be kind of in a administrative role, like, HR or clerical or an assistant role, some kind of, like, non-threatening role. Whereas if it was a black male in kind of like a specialist role or a partner role or an associate role or whatever, kind of like the main business of the company, he would be seen as a threat to the white, group. So in a sense, I was just saying there's a lot of racism. It's actually more against the males than the females, because the females can be like secretaries or functionaries without being as threatening to the white men. Essentially, they might be threatening to the white women, but that's kind of a separate issue. And that's kind of aligns with my own experience professionally in New York City, or just walking around like Midtown Manhattan or something like that. And so, this was just one element as a part of a broader point that I was making. But unfortunately, my father decided to just really hunker down and be like, nope, I'm not accepting that fact. I am just not accepting that. That's your opinion. And then just like, hold up your entire point, because I do not accept that fact. There has to be an absolutely equal amount of racism against, black females and black males. Has to be absolutely equal. There's no lab testing, but it has to absolutely be equal, because there's no gender aspect to it. It's just color. There's no gender to it. And so that became a fight. He called me a racist, even though tonight he was the one saying all this racist shit, and I wasn't. He called you a racist. Not because of anything I said tonight. He was just like, well, you've said racist things in the past. You've taunted. Yeah, okay, so in the past I've used some racially charged language, maybe against individuals that I encountered and had some problems with. In frustration. I think this is kind of, a situation where you're in traffic and a fat guy cuts you off and you give him the finger and say, oh, you fat fuck. I mean, does that really mean that you're a sizeist or, a deplorable lookist? So I think that, unfortunately, we've got, I'm glad that this happened tonight, that I just entered an argument that wasn't started by me, with the moral desire to kind of absorb that negative energy and, just end the argument. And fortunately, I found out something unfortunate earlier now tonight than I would have later, was that my dad thinks that I'm a racist. And even when I say something that's not racist, like when I'm walking the streets of Manhattan, I don't see a lot of black male professionals. Even when I say something like that, which actually seems like the opposite of racism, it seems like I'm sympathizing with like the lack of proportionality, the lack of distribution, something that like only somebody who wasn't a complete racist would actually maybe pick up on. But just the way I said it with enthusiasm, because I'm adamant that it's an accurate assessment. My mom's like, oh, that sounds really racist for you to say. For me to say that I don't see a lot of black male professionals in the city, that's seen as racist by my mom. So my dad's racist. It doesn't let me be racist, and my mom thinks that I'm racist when I'm just pointing out a fact. Thanks, America.